When Next and Doc and Iwi started getting together around the same table, could we do a demonstration project of, if you combined all these things, business, philanthropy, community, iwi, could we restore the ecology of this mountain? Was the kind of the primary question at the time when we started.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Kia ora and welcome. Today's guest is Jan Hania. This conversation is a terrific introduction to Jan's accomplished track record in the conservation space of Aotearoa New Zealand. He offers his insights into Māori cosmology and Mātauranga, and we go deeper around Taranaki Mounga and how this sits within the broader rights of nature movement. I'm fortunate to work with Jan at Biome Trust, a charitable trust dedicated to ecological stewardship and well-being. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too, with my friend and colleague, Jan Hania. Today, we are here with my colleague, Jan Hania. He is a principal at Biome Trust, also a director of several organizations, including Mangroa Farms, Cawthron Institute, Genomics Aotearoa, Opepe Farm, and other iwi-related organizations. Thank you so much, Jan, for being here.
Kia ora, Matthew. Thank you.
And so maybe we can start off a bit of an introduction and your background.
Yeah, sure. Kia ora. Kia ora mo tātou. He uri ahau o Ngāti Tūwhare Toa. Ngāti Raukaua te au ki te tonga. Te Aotearoa me Ngāti Tama hoki. These are iwi of Aotearoa from where I've been born and raised. I grew up in the southern end of the Manukau Harbour, a very small beach community called Glenbrook Beach, and really had the privilege from a very young age of heeding my mother's words, my mother's whakatauki of, go outside and play. So as a child, I had a really unrestricted play environment of a whole beach and sort of a 10-kilometre radius of that beach, which is a peninsula and a harbour, which is really very safe. There's nothing that could bite us apart from sharks in the harbour, and a pup tent and a bike. And, with that unrestricted playtime, I was naturally in nature all of the time, pretty much, apart from going to school. And our whole life regulated around what the tide was doing. As a child, once a month we would go and gather scallops from a particular muddy beach flat when the tide was in a king tide cycle, lunar cycle out. And we'd always take the same size bucket and only go once, and the same people would go on that particular day, and that's all they would do. And that scallop, hatchery lasted for quite a while. And as I was growing up, I noticed it changing. Silt from the harbour, from land use change, decimated that. Invasive oysters came into the harbour. There were, particular mussel beds around a large industrial complex on that harbour which were deformed from whatever was going into that harbour, and I was noticing these things. The bush at the bottom of my house started getting cut into by development, and the birds disappeared, and the skinks that they used to run around on our lawn were getting eaten by the cats. And so as a child, it was very noticeable. My father was a classic Dutch immigrant, hardworking, stern, had lived through, as a child, the ravages of World War II. And so he had, escaped what were constructs there of, the very disciplined life that he'd had to live as a child, and was the renegade younger child, and came to New Zealand where I met my mum, her Māori princess, who'd also had a difficult time, as their family had survived the ravages of coloniality. So one was a victim of imperialism in the European War, and the other was a victim of coloniality, or survivors of coloniality in Aotearoa. And they met, and honestly, I take my hats off to them. They did the best they could to give us, me and my sister, the life that we had. We had a beach. We were very poor, but I felt rich. I had a dinghy when I was 5 years old. I remember, saving up recycled glass bottles from rubbish bins and going to the flea market with my mum and bought a dive mask when I was 6 years old, and just being enthralled by watching sea anemones and inspired by Shark's Cousteau. I had an affinity for being outside. Mm. With my father's kind of background as in engineering, the hard skills engineering as a boilermaker welder, my mother had the softer, profession of a caregiver as a palliative care nurse. Had sort of both ends of that spectrum in my life, and my dad's kind of mission was get a job. None had vocational, had sort of tertiary education at all. And I went through school and did quite well because I had access to books my whole life. So I had a lot of good reading, encouragement from my parents. But my father's mission was get a job with the government, and technology is the way to go. He'd bring me phones to pull apart and clocks and things as a young kid, which I did. And so I sort of, tuned into fixing things, and technology and communications and all that stuff was the way to go. I left school at 15 and did a trade as a linesman where, I can remember joining the first fibre optic cable in our region as a trainee linesman, which was, 40 years ago or so. And then realising that trade was a little bit limited, and there's probably more to learn and more of a horizon for me. So I joined the New Zealand Air Force as an avionics technician, and went through, all that communications, aircraft engineering training. And at the same time, really had the opportunity to do a ton of other stuff. As you do in the military, you can go parachuting, you can go scuba diving, do aid work around the islands. You can go and work in Rwanda and do aid work into support work into the Gulf War, and all these things were expanding my horizons. But there was an element there which captured me very strongly while I was in the military, was mountaineering and outdoor leadership training. And how when you took people into the environment, you really, after a couple of days, saw them becoming their real self. And as a leadership coach at the time, or a convener of these things, we were trying to develop resilience and adaptability in people. I was about 23, 24 at the time. I could see that being in the environment was restorative, and that was my natural place. When I first got to do it when I was about 19 or so in the Air Force, in my training, I thought, wow, people are paying me to do this. Whereas for a lot of people, it was their first time to go tramping in the mountains, their first time to go swimming in a mountain lake or whatever it was. And I thought, wow, by the time I was 23, 24, I was reading a bit more philosophically around what the world meant. And I was sort of growing up myself, and I realised my passion wasn't so much wasn't technology, but was more how does technology apply to wellness in the environment, and had some almost epiphanies, if you like, whilst climbing in very remote mountain landscapes, finding that once you'd been sweating for 15 hours on a long rope climb, multiple pitches, getting to the top of that particular hill in the bottom of Fiordland without anyone, well, not that many people around you for a 100-kilometre radius, had a really almost a life-changing realisation of synchronicity with God and life. To me, it just landed on me, having climbed up this hill completely, almost physically depleted, but spiritually most enlivened I'd ever been. And the realisation was God is love and all things are connected. It was just a big boom, really. And so I was thinking about doing what my real life passion was, and it was going to either be environmental education or environmental engineering, applying technology to these spaces. I realised, I was thinking my mind was young enough and agile enough to do a degree in natural resources engineering, which is kind of slightly adapting from the electronics engineering I'd had. And fortunate to find that degree in Canterbury, Lincoln in the South Island of New Zealand, which happened to be in view of the mountains I love to go climbing in the weekend. So it all made perfect sense. I didn't have any commitments. I had, time. I had money in the bank, had bought a couple of houses by then. And so I went off to university and of all the traditional engineering stuff, thermodynamics and fluid mechanics and all that high-end maths, loved it. But the two subjects that really resonated strongly for me and captured me and have stayed with me ever since Māori cosmology, indigenous lens into the deep mātauranga, the deep knowledge of Māori, knowledge systems and reverence of gods and creation stories and all those things. There was that one, and there was another guy, Keith Morrison, who was quite a famous lecturer at Canterbury and Lincoln, because he had written his PhD in a cave, and it was called Postmodernism Management of Floodplains, which would be totally relevant in today's environment where they're all getting smashed apart by these storms that were being predicted 25 years ago. And so having done all the kind of, and it wasn't completely linear, but there was some dynamics around, how to restore contaminated sites and hydrology and all those things. But those two, cosmology and soft systems, human ecology that Keith was teaching really resonated strongly for me. I was just thinking differently about how we operate in our world. From there, I was fortunate to get a job consulting at a leading groundwater hydrogeology consultant, which was looking at the technical solutions to hydrology and where to put landfills and how to, restore contaminated sites. And it was cool for the base learning of how that system worked, but on the other hand, it was challenging because, at the end of the day, you were a hired gun and you did the work for who had the most money. So, well, this is an interesting system that we live in. We should be serving the environment. And so I then dived into local government, what role does government play in the environmental space? And I ended up being the hazard analyst for the Wellington region where we're located now, and kind of understanding that part of the world and how, again, 23 years ago, hazards and climate change impacts and earthquake risk mitigation and, tsunami and all these things were relevant in our planning social context. What do we do about it? Fell in love, met my beautiful wife, Lara, and she is an educator and storyteller. However, she was living in the middle of the North Island Te Kuti, and I was living in Wellington, and the 6-hour drives on a Friday night were slightly tedious. And so one of us had to move. She wasn't giving up on her children that she was teaching. And so I had to move, and I moved to co-locate. We married and travelled. I worked in climate change adaptation in London with Aotearoa's international company, which was looking at, how the hydraulics of Venice would work when the sea level rose. How you'd move all the services in Liverpool, St. Petersburg and London out of the way so you could put cycle lanes in. How the Thames Barrier Gate was designed to operate 3 times a year, and the year I was there, it operated 27 times. Change was happening fast, and these guys were onto it way back then. Just prior to that, our honeymoon was 8 months travelling, 6 months of that on a tandem mountain bike in China, from Beijing into Mongolia and southern Spain, around Holland, Denmark, Germany, really understanding, wow, there's these awesome ways of travelling in the world, so there's this kind of hobby going on at the same time of cycle and travel and being immersed in nature at the same time. Yeah, and so working in London, as soon as we got the tandem bike, we found ourselves pregnant. and with our first child, and home was the place to be. And so we planned to come home after 6 months of earning some pounds. Fell into local government again, working as a design engineer in the Hawke's Bay, looking at their floodplain regimes and how they did, wetland restoration and mostly water-based infrastructure, both natural and built. Wanted to move up the chain, I suppose, and sort of learning a lot from a lot of people around me, and moved up to Hamilton, which is closer to Lara's hometown, my wife's hometown, Waikato Regional Council, where after doing the standard engineer work, there was another opportunity to lead the Lake Taupo Protection Project, which was, one of the more advanced in the world, actually, because it developed a non-point source trading regime for nitrogen credits within a catchment, within a confined catchment. So people could trade nitrogen credits, and the trust that was employing us was buying nitrogen out of the catchment to reduce the non-point source impacts of nitrogen on the lake, the jewel of the North Island, if not the country, large freshwater lake, Lake Taupo, which, if intensification of land use had have continued, the nitrogen impacts would have had quite a significant deleterious impact. So implemented that, learned some stuff about computer modelling in that space, and realised, wow, all these regional councils around New Zealand weren't talking to each other. There was incoherency around how we were nationally going at the approach of landscape restoration, landscape regeneration, if you like. And so I made a choice to go and work for DOC, a Department of Conservation here in New Zealand, which I saw as managing at least the upland of most catchments, because 33% of New Zealand is largely in the DOC estate, and that's largely in the mountainous areas where most of the water comes from. And as well as managing biodiversity and bioregional threats and heritage and all these things. I went there to learn how they did that and how that integrated with what I had learned in London.
What year was that roughly?
That would have been 2006 probably, 2007. 2009 I went to DOC, and then DOC was, had some amazing experiences. What are the risks to biodiversity in New Zealand? It's largely about predators. That's one of the major threats here. There's a whole story about that. And then DOC was going through its changes, how to be more relevant, because in New Zealand, most of our biodiversity metrics are plummeting, either at risk, declining, threatened. And there's very few stories in New Zealand of our biodiversity populations going up. There's a couple, but they're isolated and in highly constructed environments. I then could see the tension that was growing in the country around iwi, Treaty of Waitangi settlements, and how, again, the cosmology of iwi, or iwi Māori, was not being recognised as a valid proposition in how to manage large landscapes. And largely the nation state of New Zealand was being quite paternalistic around these settlements and quite constrained in offering what should be, or which is enshrined, at least in words, in the Treaty of Waitangi, of equity, of partnership regime management. What was being offered by the Crown was much less than that. And it was kind of sad and also angering and quite motivating. Well, heck, there's an opportunity here. And I took the next role to sit in between which is another step up the chain in DOC as a conservator, as well as a number of other roles in the East Coast Bay of Plenty Conservancy. But I said to my wife, the Tūhoi Treaty of Waitangi negotiation is about to get underway, and that's going to be pretty formative and potentially quite progressive, potentially, because if in that landscape, Tūhoi who are propositioning, if they ran education, health, landscape management of what was Te Rewera National Park, they could bring a bring a better outcome. And I could see that. I think there's absolute potential for that if done well. So I went to work in that space to help translate. That ran its course and settled and got to a particular place as one of the first or earlier legal personhood settlements in New Zealand.
And that was the Te Urewera Act.
The Te Urewera Act.
And we had a great conversation with Aaron Matariki Carr about that act and some of its ramifications and looking at the context now and some of the lessons learned. Yeah. Please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, on reflection, it was quite a step change in the history of law and law LORE in New Zealand, but also was still foundationally constrained a lot by the legislation and courage of the government at the time, let alone the lack of integration of government to act as a good partner. And I'm sure Aaron spoke a lot into that space because there are a lot of opportunities there. I then, in that journey, also realised and had met with philanthropy as a thing. And it was back when I was in Hawke's Bay, and it wasn't long after I'd arrived when Julian Robertson's agents had travelled out from the US, and he had operated as a philanthropic entity in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and mostly in art and medical research and some land purchases, large golf courses which had ecological outcomes built into them, you know, as far as they could. It was fascinating because, there was a lot of scepticism about philanthropy in government, and a lot of misunderstanding about what it could be. I had always worked on a kind of relationality type mode of operating in the roles I had or led, and had good relationships with the regional council from a past role, had good relationships with iwi who I had, been interacting with in the DOC Treaty of Settlement space. And so I these guys turned up on my doorstep, and I said, wow, you guys want to come here and do some environmental stuff? That's really awesome. Let me ring the CEO of the council, let me ring the CEO and the chairman of this iwi group and this community group, and let's go to a place and just imagine. And we did. We went up to Lake Tutera, which was a catchment just north of Napier, which had some DOC, a mainland island project in it. It had regional council, erosion management, water control projects, had a community group wanting to restore land, and had an iwi group who had mana whenua status going through a treaty settlement, who are looking at outcomes for people and environment together. And with the kind of activator, if you like, of the philanthropic entity, which became the Aotearoa Foundation, Julian Robertson's iteration here in New Zealand, they started asking questions, because DOC and council were just about the species and the land and the trees, which was cool. Iwi were about people and culture and workforce and long-term intergenerational outcomes. And the philanthropic entity were asking questions about how do you tie these things together? Put us a proposition, which we did, was successful, and it became He Poutere Awa Tāne, the Great Baskets of Knowledge of Tāne, which was genuinely looking to reverse biodiversity decline and build connection into the landscape, but in what you might say now is a very early iteration of that. I subsequently went up to Rotorua with Tūhoi and could see the more bolder vision for iwi partnership and landscape management. DOC went through some more iterations and said, there's other roles around. And so I purposefully chose, with the grace of my wife, the South Island, where we now live in Nelson, Te Tauia Te Waka, the top of the South Island, to learn about large landscape management. In the region I was initially in, went from Haast to Kaikoura, effectively half of the South Island, which had, 6 national parks and a whole lot of massive reserves. On the west coast, 90% of the west coast is in DOC reserve.
Beautiful country. Beautiful
and alive and intact, and you can drink from all the rivers and, climb in the mountains. Still has its challenges, but it's a wonderful place to bring up young children from where we were, and a great place to learn about large landscape management. I'd held on to these kind of, the iwi aspirations, the potential for philanthropic, engagement, how councils worked and how communities could work. And the early iteration of the Next Foundation manifested first as Project Jan Zoon. Devin McLean, effectively a leading environmental entrepreneur in New Zealand, had brought the founders of the Next Foundation to Abel Tasman National Park, and they had a couple of questions. Could funding shift outcomes in biodiversity at a landscape scale? And could private sector work well with government in a closed environment, in a project which necessarily needed to have community and iwi in it, but would also bring business acumen of clear focus, single metrics, and long-term funding to shift outcomes in biodiversity. And I landed in Nelson as that was beginning, and sat with Devin and said, well, this is cool. There might be all these other things we could do, and between us, and with the help of the team at DOC, we schemed up a proposition for 10 large landscape restoration projects across New Zealand, and boldly set off on the next one. And by that time, I'd started working for Next, because I'd been in a partnership directorship role for DOC, and they said, well, come and help us, and that worked well for me. And that's why I had been working for the last 8 years prior to meeting Matthew and the formative Biome Trust. So, yeah, that the next project off the list after Abel Tasman Jan Zoon was Taranaki Mounga. And that to me is one of the kind of more pervasive and deeply built into the community projects around. And there are others that are looking to emulate off there. So I'll talk about that for a little bit.
Oh, please.
Sorry if I'm doing too much talking.
No, it's great. It's great. I'm appreciating getting this kind of landscape scale overview of not only the chronology of your background and career, but also, you just have this very rich perspective into different ecological projects and social and community projects here in Aotearoa. So it's super helpful. Please.
Very privileged to have worked around all of New Zealand in different roles and formats, private, government, etc. Taranaki, if you haven't been there, and maybe there's some photos we could show, but it's as a region, Taranaki Mounga, he koro, sits as a huge icon in the region. It's a massive mountain volcanic geological sequence, which is very prominent to everyone who ever goes to that region, even that part of the world. You can see it from other regions. You can see it from across the country. You
can see it from space as well.
You can see it from space.
Yeah.
And there's a rich iwi history in Taranaki, and there are some internationally well-known movements came out of Parihaka Te Whiti o Rongomai, modelled on by people like Gandhi, who saw peaceful resistance, pacifist resistance, as a better way of activism. And when Māori were going through the difficult challenges of colonisation in the mid to late 1800s, there were wars and challenges to the Māori way of life, and confiscations and terrible brutality was imparted on Māori, both at structural, legislative, colonial levels. Tons of legislation was written: the Anti-Tohunga Act, the Anti-Dog Act, the Māori Land Alienation Act, the Education Act. All were artefacts of coloniality as part of the greater, doctrine of discovery that was going on across the planet, of a couple of hundred years of imperial coloniality. That was impacting in New Zealand as well. However, the reaction in Taranaki through Te Whiti o Rongomai and others, they led a more determined, peaceful resistance, and a highly, and I think, I'm no expert, there are others, graceful and strongly values leadership-led approach to how to stand up to the impact of coloniality back at the time. Related or otherwise, and I think it's related, there has been a significant and deep connection of that intact Māori cosmology, both overtly in, structural resistance of, hundreds of petitions to the government saying this is wrong, this confiscation is wrong, these acts are wrong, all the way through the last 150 years, right up to settlement, which is actually being ratified in 2 weeks' time. Another story. My point is that in Taranaki there was a significant connection by at least Māori and others to this mountain, and a deep history, and a deep spiritual and physio-geographical connection to this mountain. The regional council there had done a leading role in the country of really doing the simplest thing of encouraging and investing in planting riparian margins around all its rivers, as much as it could, and as far ahead of the rest of the country in that space. So there were some kind of enabling factors in the region. That's where I'm heading. And there are others. When Next and Doc and iwi started getting together around the same table, could we do a demonstration project of, if you combined all these things, business, philanthropy, community, iwi, could we restore the ecology of this mountain? Was the kind of the primary question at the time when we started. And we came up with a business plan and a way of doing that, and predator control and experts in technology, with iwi at the table, in more than an equitable way. So the governance of the Taranaki Mounga board, which is a limited liability for purpose charitable company, was set up with Jamie Tuta, who is a very well-known iwi leader in both business and Māori, as the chair. Hemi Sundgren, who had a deep history and understanding of history and connection to the Mounga and all the tribal entities, 8 entities of Taranaki Mounga, was nominated as the iwi representative. Next, as a board member, as directors of the company, and then we had the local CEO of a community foundation funding, and Shell New Zealand, who were, at the time it wasn't known, but were exiting the region and were looking to leave a legacy to the community. And between them, for 10 years in different timeframes, so also Sam Morgan, an independent philanthropist in New Zealand, funded early days, built a consortium of compatible partners to invest in a $2 million a year program to restore the ecology of the mountain, in partnership with the Department of Conservation as well. What became apparent, and hats off to the collection of people at the table, was it couldn't just be about ecology. It had to be about long-term, effective, altruistic finance. It had to be about reconnection of people in that landscape to the people, and it had to be about iwi-led, iwi values-led, and actually demonstrated. And so we adapted plans over those last 8 years to achieve those things as much as we could in that time. And largely that's on a longer journey. Nature doesn't change in 5 minutes. And so there's been elements of the ecology restored, goats have been removed, ungulates. There's new species of biodiversity, tautoa on that mountain. And you could probably say that all of the ecological metrics are starting to hit the bottom of the curve and starting to head up because we removed the threats. Now, when we started that project 18 years ago, at the same time, iwi were just gathering together, the 8 iwi of Taranaki, to start negotiating with the government on what their treaty settlement for the mountain could be, because it had been confiscated and put into a national park construct. And while we were building the company and the workforce, demonstrating that iwi-led values applied at landscape could actually do a better job of restoring the mountain and getting aligned philanthropy and business interests in cadence, coherently restoring this landscape, iwi could go to the table and say, guess what? With these values and this joined up effort, we have and are restoring this mountain. Now, that's been a difficult and challenging settlement process for Liana, Hemi, and Jamie. And however, they have landed at a place of settlement, and as I said earlier, they're about to ratify that and sign off that settlement, which puts that Mounga as the third iteration of legal personhood in Aotearoa. Te Urewera, Tawatupa, Whanganui River, the first two, and Taranaki Mounga is the third, and has some other nuances to its construct. These are all learnings, and each one is getting better, and each iteration of legislation change, moving from balancing law, LOW, and law, LORE, and then being able to implement these things at place is a summary of some of my career. And there's been a range of other things along the way, but that's an introduction. Sorry.
Well, it was an introduction and a really good dive into the Taranaki Mountain, the Mounga, which I want to just stay with that for a moment. And so what I hear from you is that there was the beginning stages was a vision of restoring the ecology. And what you learned was that very much was also about involving the community and having effective financing flows for the longevity and involving this kind of diverse group of stakeholders. And some of the things I've seen in the materials around the success of this project included just how much engagement from even like adolescent youth who then developed a relationship with the mountain and managed their trap lines, but then were able to get livelihood and jobs, in the context of conservation. And, it just like bringing ecological health and community health together. All those things start to mirror, and it's like a prism of how it's so interrelated and interconnected. I'm curious, other reflections on just that project in particular, and then I'd love to ask a bit more about the legal personhood side.
Yeah, there's so much in that. We realised at an early stage, as the kind of conveners, the executive team, if you like, that the only way this would succeed if everyone had agency or relevance in it. And more so too, that the restoration of iwi and their cosmology of indigenous cosmology was applied. And we had some sort of core values which we tried to live, and one of them would manifest as our role was to ensure that everyone else in that community, Rossington Mountain, was successful. Mana akitanga. If we could ensure that all the funders had a place, all the rest of the ecological groups didn't feel like their mana was being taken away from, if the business community could see a role for them in it, then the entire we're weaving a network of success rather than just a particular place of success.
So my job is not to be successful. My job is to make you successful, and this person is successful.
Absolutely right. And build trust. And in making others successful and actually ensuring that they have a role that they determine in it, be it iwi, business or community or government, then actually the knitting and relationality and coherency of your approach becomes way more apparent and effective. We also had, at the time I was on the board of the Biological National Science Heritage Challenge, a program of mission-focused science investment programs in New Zealand. And we'd been involving science investment in New Zealand at the same time to be more co-governed, living the treaty partnership. And we had also been, as we've been doing on the Taranaki Mounga project, being really careful about narrative. and story and enlivening in a way where everyone was part of the picture as much as we could. And iwi were taking more of a prominence. The science challenge in its, wisdom could see that this was a bit different and funded under that umbrella of work that was going on, reteaching narrative and pūrākau to the team, so that the karakia or incantations, waiata and songs of old were being re-enlivened and taught to the team. So that when they went into the mountain, they not only had the technology of apps and tools and sensing, what have you, they were starting to familiarise themselves and relearn the ancient ways of seeing the world through karakia and through waiata. And there's so much knowledge stored in the art of karakia, of these incantations and waiata, that when you're sitting calmly on a mountain and you start understanding what the words of these karakia and waiata are, they have depths of knowledge which has been put away. Mm. And it's just the beginning of unpacking and re-enlivening and refamiliarising the rangatahi, the younger people, with these doorways into knowledge, which is not only the Western, right? And I think that's there's a lot of that going on all around New Zealand now, where the wisdom of the ancient, of our kaumātua, our tupuna, is being, is that what that meant? Mm. The state of the winds, the state of the stars, the state of the seasons, the state of the flora and fauna moving through seasons is now being seen as written in these songs and waiata and karakia, and now being seen as totally legitimate knowledge system to be applied and listened to at place. It's still fledgling. A lot was lost, and we can talk a whole session on the education system and what it doesn't teach us, and what we need to unlearn to make space in our minds to be more familiar with the ancient. I kind of don't like the word technology, the ancient wisdom. Ways of seeing the world, so that we bring a more balanced approach to restoring landscapes and people in it.
Question on that. I mean, so much of the conversation when you talk about things like Māori cosmology or Mātauranga is understandably coupled with the conversation of, how it was lost through what you called coloniality or colonization, and through all of the many injustices that have occurred. And I feel there's a bit of a question about, are these different ways of knowing, are these wisdoms accessible and appropriately accessed by those of us who aren't Māori, by those of us who are Pākehā or other, origin? And I'm curious if you can comment a bit on how you see the evolution of this conversation to bring everyone along.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, because we had the privilege of sharing a trip recently to Ecuador and Costa Rica, and I've always been very interested in other indigenous cultural narratives and knowledge systems for a long time, and I could see the world as looking for a way to rewrite the situation we're in. We've built a system of imperial capitalism, if you like, Western methodologies of democracy, which have aggregate power in a particular knowledge system and have taken power from the other knowledge system, the indigenous knowledge system. And now people are looking to find balance and look for better ways to re-narrate and then govern, finance, knowledge our way out of this terrible predicament we're in. I think in the New Zealand and what I saw in the Ecuadorian landscape, there has to be both trust and authenticity built, and that's largely done at place in face-to-face relationships. It can't just be written in a book and handed over via a podcast or via a written form. I think that you can get to a certain depth in that mode, and that's cool as an introduction. But what I feel and what I see is that when you go to the ecocultural landscape, the bioregional landscape, and have a relationship and start to understand, the impacts of coloniality and the deprivation and poverty that has been caused by the current, inequitable capitalist system, and then you start sharing in the how can we help together solve this, then the more relational, reciprocal, respectful ways of indigenous knowledge systems can be better shared. It's not something you can script out in the abstract. It's deeply entwined in the landscape and context that it sits, and I think that's a key element. It's not that it's being held in secrecy; it's being held in trust. And I think those trust layers need to be built solidly first. And so I tend to spend a lot of my time looking to build networks of trust so that we can, build pathways for the indigenous people at place, Māori, to build their own path and their own equitable restoration in their way, whilst offering through the relationships that we might have through Biome or Next or elsewise, technologies or other relationships that we have access to enable that restoration, that regeneration, but in a way that has the dignity and agency of being tino rangatiratanga, self-led.
Yeah, beautiful. I love this. It's not held in secrecy, it's held in trust. So in terms of getting back to the significance of the Mounga and, what's taken place there, can you talk a bit more, unpack this rights of nature legal personhood framework and what that means and why is this significant?
Yeah, so it's an interesting, some might call it a clash, some might call it a weaving of the two worlds of the Western construct and the indigenous cosmological construct, and language too, right? So when we were beginning the build of that project, the Taranaki Mounga project, which is the restoration, in parallel, the Treaty of Waitangi negotiations were starting. Some strong messages were coming through from iwi around how do we symbolise and narrate the language. And one of the kind of vision statements for the project, which was considered, was for him, for us, which speaks a lot to it, really. The Mounga is more than a physical geological feature. It is a person, it is a koro, a grandfather, a tupuna. It has human vibration and energy, meta-human, if you like, and that it is alive. And it is much larger than us and much bigger as a connected whole of all of nature, but symbolises and represents our lineage, our whakapapa, our connection to the whole. So there's a whole worldview wrapped up in those words, which completely connects the person to his family, his hapu, wider family, his iwi, and the land and the water and the place. It's completely connected. It's not an isolated individual entity as what is personified in the rational man of neoclassical economics. It is the opposite, it is a total connected entity. And so when you start thinking about the cosmology and then the narrative and knowledge systems that come from that, it becomes, as I was saying before, like a clash, law, L-O-R-E, of total connection and humility to the greater nature, Ranginui and Papatūānuku, versus the individual, entity of a human or a business or anything else which is separate. And so the legislation, which is evolving around the world and is possibly ahead in some ways in New Zealand, is written that the Urewera, the Wanganui River, and now Taranaki Mounga have legal personhood characteristics. And even that is diminishing because it's greater than a person, but it's a language that works for now. And the construct of the board, which will govern the planning and allocation of resources and frameworks, has definite responsibilities rather than rights, has specific responsibilities to restore the mountain and the mana of the mountain, and to restore the connection of people to it and to each other in doing so.
And just because it's so important for those who aren't familiar with the concept or the word mana.
Yeah, mana is, it's not straightforward to translate because, again, it depends on context, as all of Indigenous concepts tend to be related to context. And mana, on one definition, is something like prestige or power, earned respect, dignity, authenticity, all those things relate to mana. It also relates to, the framework of Māori values. If you think of rangatiratanga, which is often defined as a way of leadership, or tino rangatiratanga, self-determination, the ultimate leadership, other definitions of that are rangatira, to weave people together for a purpose, rangatiratanga, the purpose of weaving, for weaving together. And then another manifestation of that meaning in Māoridom, rangatiratanga is also defined not by how much one holds or accumulates, but how much one shares and gives away. And so mana akitanga, which is a word for sharing or giving power away, manifests from rangatiratanga, so they relate. And so mana is actually how you restore others and restore yourself in reciprocity at the same time. There's a whole longer conversation around these elements which come through in Māori indigenous, generally value systems. And again, I don't like decoding, but for the purpose of translating here, there are some common terms which come up a lot across indigenous nations across the world around the priority, if you like, of relationality, of reciprocity, of giving and receiving, of respect, which relates to humility, in fact, that we are the younger sibling of nature, of reverence. This is beyond us, and we will never understand it all, but we have a role to play in serving, reverence, and responsibility to act with those other values in play. So mana relates to all of those. And some, just while we're on this, some more recent words, if you like, that have come through are regeneration and redistribution, which I think also play into this space as well. So if you think about enhancing mana, we're enhancing all of these things for the greater whole, much greater than ourselves as an individual entity.
Right. So just to recap, one more R word there. So this cosmology really is defining a lot of the intent around legal personhood, rights of nature, embodiment, where we're saying, okay, the best we can do with the current legal structures and concepts that we have is this recognition that this mountain is not, it's not a resource, it's not property, it is alive, it's interconnected, it is, we are the younger sibling in this relationship, and we have responsibilities to restore and to elevate the mana of this mountain. And there is a governance group who is tasked with that very heavy burden of responsibility, and that this is now, taken shape in the legal recognition of our country through being catalyzed through a settlement of the reconciliation of the Crown and iwi in terms of the Treaty of Waitangi, and that that settlement process has also been a catalyst for these other bodies of nature, the Wanganui River and Te Uruera as well. But it's not necessarily a precondition that these settlements have to take place for us to bring rights of nature law into place, and rights of nature being a somewhat crude term from an Aotearoa context, but a term that is becoming more recognized globally to describe this movement afoot to essentially give a different form of legal recognition to nature and to bodies of nature, and something that really Ecuador was the first in terms of a constitutional level recognition of rights of nature. Bolivia has implemented this, and throughout Turtle Island, United States, we have many different cases and examples now of rights of nature blossoming, maybe less so in Europe at the moment, but it seems to be a common impulse and kind of a growing legal movement that many terrific groups like Earth Law Center are also helping to steward along. But looks different in different places and has different connotations, and we're still just discovering what does it actually mean, which is my next question for you, which is like, practically speaking, all of this effort to bring these types of concepts alive, but what does it really mean, and how does it show up?
Yeah, great summary. Thanks. I was recently looking at one of Kate Raworth's lists of, how you define a regenerative enterprise. And you look at, just by comparison to what we're doing in Aotearoa, you look at purpose. Taranaki Mounga purpose is pretty clear. Governance, who decides? Ownership. Slightly abstract term in a Māori cosmological sense, but it has relevance in today's world. Finance, and I think almost most importantly is networks. Look at those elements of any enterprise, any new cooperative or land trust or whatever it is around the world. I think those elements will be very key to how you are looking at your purpose and delivering on the restoration of the system that it sits in. So as I was saying earlier, we strive at the start of the Taranaki Mounga project and in other iwi-led projects I'm privileged to be familiar with, work with, is that don't just look at the individual entity or its success. It's actually how does the whole system restore, regenerate, become more enabled, because nothing lives alone and can't. And so we spent all that time, as I said earlier, how do we ensure others in that network are successful and then have a long-term connection and rebuild relationship to that place and to themselves. I think we've got a lot to learn together, and no one entity has the answer and no one textbook. But if we can bring some of these principles we've been talking about here into play, in place, with the courage, with the humility, with the connection and the authenticity of service to the greater whole, then we will start solving some of these more challenging issues. I think that, for instance, the finance challenge, how it manifests in the Taranaki space, at least, is that the finance flow, which was being generated from concessions, which were licenses to operate in a national park for whatever reason, be it a cell phone tower through to a cup of tea shop, they had to pay a license to operate in the national park. Well, now all those concessions will be going back to the mountain. So there's an ongoing capital flow there.
So I just want to really put a point on that. So basically, now the finance flows are going to be distributed by this governance group on behalf of the mountain. And that's really, what our friend Austin Wade Smith would refer to as economic legibility for the mountain, not just legal legibility. Is that right?
Absolutely right. And further to that, another iteration is that it can hold assets. I haven't read the legal definition of that yet, and it's still to play out. But that could mean people can gift land to the mountain. People could gift shares. People could gift data. And each one of those elements could be a podcast, actually. But, as I say, it's formative. The group's just being formed, and it just it unpacks quite an opportunity. If you are implementing those values in a landscape which has an iconic, compelling geophysical and spiritual feature, the possibilities are quite interesting. It also plays out in another role I have, which is chair of a limited partnership farm trust in Taupo, where in New Zealand a lot of indigenous land is held in various forms of Māori land-specific trusts. And this particular farm, Opepe Farm, has 5,000 owners and 30,000 beneficiaries. And again, this whole construct of ownership is an artifact of coloniality in Western LAW. It is what it is, but what it drove back then was a running to the corners of defending your land block that your name was on. What's happening now in that space is almost like a mini form of the Taranaki Mounga concept, where the separate 100 or more land trusts around Lake Taupo, some of them are starting to say, well, hang on, we can't solve this on our own with our small finite piece of land or asset, whatever it is. How about we start having the common vision for all of us? How do we do that? So on the one hand, we have a lot of the land trusts looking to be regenerative, remove, chemical poisoning and be more humane in practice and restore soil and biodiversity whilst you're farming. It's not easy. It's a harsh landscape. Whilst learning how to collaborate as a group of entities for a grander common purpose. There's a Mounga that sits within the collective of some of these land trusts called Tauhara Mounga. If all these land trusts started operating in coherency and collaboration, could that be restored? And then how do we shift the profit that comes off some of the enterprises, either by, fiscal profit of selling food, through to other investments, which in themselves are, classified as regenerative. Can we then start taking the fiscal profit to create greater wealth profit in terms of restoring land, mountain and people in that particular context? Yeah. So I've shifted the conversation slightly to a more, a smaller version but similar learning where in the world, how do we collaborate? Yeah. How do we have relationality, and how do we genuinely build trust to restore nature, moving from the sanctity of the individual to the sanctity of the collective?
And this is really what brought us together, right? This shared inquiry of large landscape scale restoration that has to include all of the different parts to come together. And, what are those opportunities for a diverse group of stakeholders to come around a shared vision and shared values, and to be courageous and authentic, and to move at the speed of trust, and to, really make a difference at a bioregional scale. And I think in that conversation and inquiry that we've been having and exploring, which also dovetails into the question of where does philanthropy sit in that, one thing I've really appreciated about your mental model is how you've been thinking about the different stakeholders required before action is really enabled. Like, what are those enabling conditions? And also your language around, not necessarily just using the word bioregion. And if you can maybe share more of how you're thinking about this topic.
Yeah, thanks. It builds into that those R words, respect. History has shown us clearly how the evolution of the state, the Westminster system and education has taught us to, work for the individual and have your own house and do all those things. There is, the indigenous model is not that. And I think there needs to be the humility and courage of individuals who have grown up in that world, and a lot of people are coming to it now to realise that isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
So at an individual level, there needs to be both the grace and dignity from all concerned, be it Māori or elsewise, to understand that we are all learning in this space. I have some things to offer and you have some things to offer, but there is a level of the individual like me, myself, learning how to be more humble and more open and more courageous and more inquiring, whilst being, able to give and share in trust the pieces of the puzzle that I bring, whilst allowing the openness and space for others to bring theirs, be it from government, be it from philanthropy, be it from the business world. There's a real need, I think, to understand the sufficiency of the individual, as George Monbiot's phrases, to the abundance and the commons, and shifting our mindsets and our enterprises and our businesses and our governance and governments to see those as actually the steps we need to make. Now, it's not that one wins over the other. This is not what it's about. This is not a competitive thing. There are tools in the marketplace and technology which need incentives of the dollar to generate technological advances that can be used. But there are equally and equitably requirements for the collective social contracts of commons operated governance models to hold the technologies in a place of respect and reverence to the outcome of the collective good of restoring land. I've skipped through quite a lot there, but it does go back to how do we create the space to evolve as a collective of individuals sitting around an executive or a board or a team table to see beyond the constraints of the tools that are currently at hand to how do we use the best of the tools and mindsets and cosmologies applied in a landscape in a particular context to make a difference for all that is there, the water, the birds, the microbiome, us as people in it. And that's going to take quite a bit of grace and humility to get to, and these are skills we haven't been taught. Mm-hmm. And I sit with the multi kind of layered learning that we need around our spirit to be open to that learning and to be open to, how do we share technologies for the greater good in a way where the abundance for the commons starts to come through rather than it becomes aggregated in an individual or an enterprise unto itself. And these aren't easy. We don't know how to do it. And we just got to say we don't know and start being open to learning and collectives of trust in places.
Well, I'm so excited to do that, learning together. And that's really the motivation for this whole little interview series, media network podcast thing that is being birthed at the moment is how do we learn out loud and learn together and bring lots of different voices into the mix. And I'm excited to know that this is going to be just the first of hopefully many conversations that you and I get to have in these chairs, or many conversations that you will be a part of. And so, I want to break there and say to be continued for a lot of these different threads and conversations, but please leaving space for any final comments or closing thoughts that you have.
Mihi atu kia koutou mō kia koe. Mō te whānau o Biome, mō te whānau katoa. I think we are, as you say, starting on a journey of learning and sharing, and I'm both humbled and somewhat, some ways have the imposter syndrome. Do I have enough? Do we have enough to bring? And so I hope for the courage to keep going and go well with it, but also bring others along. It's very much a team game, and I want to learn alongside you and everyone else. Kia ora.
What a pleasure it was to sit down with Jan, and we really just scratched the surface on so many threads. I can't wait to go deeper in future discussions. If you enjoyed this one, you might also want to check out the conversations we had with Aaron Matariki Carr of River, as well as Jessica Hutchings of Papawhaka Rito Rito Charitable Trust. Links are in the show notes. You can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com, as well as engage with us more deeply in our community Discord. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.